Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Jill Brown, Director of Public Programs at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining us for our program today, The Legal Road to Auschwitz, presented by lawyer and museum docent Jeff Jarkow. Time permitting, Jeff will answer audience questions. So if you have a question, please click on Q&A and type your question there. This program provides 1 hour of California MCLE credit for lawyers. If you've already emailed us, we have your name on the list, but if not, if you'd like credit, please email us at info@lamoth.org and we'll add you to the list. After the program is over, we'll send you a sign-in sheet, evaluation, and MCLE certificate. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jeff Jarkow. A graduate of Cornell Law School, Jeff practices immigration law in Los Angeles. Jeff has had a long-time interest in Holocaust studies with a particular focus on its legal dimensions. He is trained at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies in Israel and has served as a docent at Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust for many years. Jeff presents continuing education programs for lawyers focused on the unique and crucial role attorneys play in safeguarding society. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. During the short time that we're going to be together, I'm going to guide you through the horrendously immoral process by which Nazi lawmakers, aided by ordinary German lawyers and judges, made the persecution, plunder, and murder of Jews and other minority groups entirely legal. We'll see how Germany's legal system morphed from one that permitted Jews to become a well-established, integrated, assimilated minority to one which outlawed Jews and other minorities. This is The Legal Road to Auschwitz. It's a presentation I developed in an effort to help answer the question, how could it have happened? How could the Holocaust have happened? And as a lawyer, I wonder, could lawyers and judges have done anything to stop it? And if so, why didn't they? Now, we can ask these questions about any profession, doctors and nurses, teachers, police officers, but it's especially important for lawyers because lawyers stand on the front line as guardians of the legal system, and at the same time, they form a disproportionate concentration of the leadership of many countries. Michael Basler, a professor at Chapman University School of Law, has written about the sophistication and independence of the German legal system prior to the Nazi takeover and of its influence on our system, the US legal system. So in this country, we borrowed our workers' compensation and Social Security laws and ideas from the German legal system. So studying the descent of the German legal system during the Nazi era really illustrates how fragile all legal systems are, including our own. But before considering the legal issues, it's important to consider the conditions under which the Nazi Party rose to power. There was World War I, 1914 to 1918, which ended in German defeat. The Treaty of Versailles imposed significant economic penalties on Germany. Germany suffered from a series of severe economic crises, beginning with the hyperinflation of the early 20s, followed by the global depression, which for the US began with the stock market crash of 1929. Then there was the Russian Revolution of 1917, at the end of toward the end of World War I, and the newly formed Soviet Union on Germany's eastern border was interfering in Germany's elections. The 1918 influenza pandemic, otherwise known as the Spanish flu, raged around the world and killed an estimated 17 to 50 million people. There were multiple elections during the period between the end of World War I and 1933 when Hitler came to power. And this quagmire, this swamp, was fertile ground for extremist parties to gain power, of which the Nazi Party was the most politically adept. People were scared. They lost their loved ones in the war. They lost their loved ones to the pandemic. They lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they lost trust in government, and they lost hope. And in this chaos, Hitler promoted a Nazi ideology which believed, in a fantastical way, that the Jews were a ruthless and all-powerful evil race that had to be eliminated. Hitler had a simple solution for all of Germany's problems. Remove the Jews from Germany and all will be solved. But the majority of Germans never voted for Hitler and the Nazi Party. However, through shrewdly manipulating a crisis, the burning down of the German parliament, I mean, basically the burning down of the government buildings, important parts of the Constitution were suspended and Hitler assumed absolute power. So what happened was emergency powers were granted to Hitler under the Constitution to deal with this major crisis, but there was no mechanism in the Constitution to take for Parliament to take that power back. Now, if you note the last bullet, April 1, 1933, boycott of Jewish-owned businesses. Saul Friedlander, he's a professor at UCLA, was a professor at UCLA, he's also a Holocaust survivor. In his book, Nazi Germany and the Jews, describes the failure of the boycott to elicit the desired enthusiasm that the Nazis had anticipated. So while generally perceived as a military takeover, it's critical to recognize how central commandeering the legal system was to the Nazis as they perpetrated the Holocaust. Hitler hoped that the anti-Semitism, which had been a long-standing part of German culture, would propel the German population to rise up and destroy the Jewish menace. But the lack of enthusiasm for the boycott not only illustrated the ambivalence of ordinary Germans to the more violent aspects of Nazi propaganda and their agenda, but also of the need to legally compel the Germans to discriminate against their Jewish neighbors. Essentially, Germany was a law-abiding country similar to the US, so the Nazis used law as a tool to push the Germans towards genocide. In this slide, I'm going to show you a clip from the USC Shoah Foundation archives. This is Lorenz Eitner. Lorenz Eitner is a native German speaker who immigrated with his family to the US at the age of 14. He was drafted into the US Army in World War II. He joined the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA. After the war, he went on to join the American prosecution team as an investigator in the Justice case, which was one of the Nuremberg trials. Now, to give you an overview of Nuremberg, most people are familiar with the one international military tribunal, which was the four Allied powers from World War II, the US, the Russians, or the USSR, the British and the French prosecuted the top Nazi war criminals. After that, in the American zone, because Germany was divided into four zones, the American, the British, the French, and the Russian. In the American zone, there were an additional 12 trials. So if you've ever heard of the horrific Nazi experiments on concentration camp inmates, the medical experiments, we have that information which was presented as evidence in the doctor's case. But what we're talking about is the justice case. Let's hear what Mr. Eitner has to say.
It's a gradual change of climate, as it were, in which certain things become more and more possible. Things that were unthinkable, even in early Nazi Germany, become more and more thinkable, and in fact become fact over time. So if you had presented the German population with the idea of expelling and exterminating Jews, if you had done that in 1934-5, you would have met with incomprehension and resistance.
So the persecution of the Jews then, the Nazis understood, had to begin with legal decrees excluding Jews from the daily life of society and stripping them of their rights as citizens. Many people have heard of the Nuremberg Laws, but there were many, hundreds and hundreds of laws, perhaps over 1,000 laws. And the Nuremberg Laws are the laws that were issued on September 15th, 1935. And all of these laws had the goal of identifying, isolating, impoverishing, outlawing, and ultimately annihilating the Jews. Nuremberg laws are important because these are the laws that deprived the Jews of citizenship. Now we're going to watch archival film footage, which I acquired from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this is Hermann Göring, Nazi leader, who's going to be reading the Nuremberg Laws. And you can see Hitler in the foreground.
German citizens are only those of German or related blood, willing to serve the German Reich and people. Marriages between Jews and citizens of German or related blood are prohibited.
So imagine you're sitting in your living room, you're a German Jew, you're having coffee in the morning, you're listening to the radio, and now you discover you're no longer a German citizen. I worked for many years with the Museum of Tolerance in their police training program, and it would be a full day of training, whether it was police academy cadets or more senior officers who would go through this periodic training. And one of the aspects of the training was for a survivor, for there to be a speaker, and oftentimes it was a Holocaust survivor. And many times that survivor was Gunther Katz, who was a lovely man. He passed away several years ago. Gunther was a German Jew. He described his experiences to the officers as a child, a 10-year-old, 10, 11-year-old in Germany. Now, Gunther's father was a combat vet for the Germans in World War I. He received the he received the Iron Cross, which is the highest medal that a combat veteran can receive in Germany for combat. He had a gun. He had friends. He knew people on the police force. He knew people in government. And inevitably, one of the police officers in our program would ask, "Why didn't you do anything? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't the Jews defend himself?" And Gunther would say, and he'd motion with his hands, he'd say, "The noose tightened very slowly." And as I said, there were hundreds and hundreds of laws. If you could divide the Holocaust into two, or the Hitler era into two, you'd have the 1933 to 39, which was the very slow motion legalization of discrimination. And then in 1939, when World War II begins with Germany's invasion of Poland, you have complete imposition of this perfected legal system onto the occupied territories, onto the Jews and other minorities, essentially outlawing them from day one. But much of what we study about the Holocaust is from the perpetrator's perspective. Nazi photographs, Nazi films, Nazi documents. In fact, at the Nuremberg trials, there were no witnesses because everything was, they were prosecuted based on their thorough documentation of what they had done. So no one hears the victim side. Now we're going to hear from the victims. This is another clip from the USC Shoah Foundation archives. This is Kenneth N., who was a German Jew as a child. He's going to describe his experiences. Let's watch.
Now, your family decided to move from Landsberg to Berlin.
The Nazis decided that for us.
How did that work?
Well, we came back from a trip to Austria, our summer vacation. And apparently, when we came back, apparently without any prior knowledge or any prior warning, my father found a letter revoking his license as an oral surgeon, revoking the lease on our apartment, and by letter from the Gestapo, from the Nazi party, ordering us out of the city. And so the Nazis very conveniently decided for us to get out of the city.
And where was it decided that you would go?
Okay, through efforts of an uncle of mine on my mother's side, we received permission of the Gestapo to enter Berlin. It was then illegal or not permitted to enter Berlin except through permission of the Gestapo, and we received that permission.
And exactly when was this?
This must have been about approximately September 1938. So about a month and a half, or possibly 2 months before the night of broken glass.
Now we're going to see a scene from the documentary, The Wannsee Conference. We're going to hear from Gabriel Bach describe his experiences as a child in Germany. Gabriel Bach, after World War II, moved to Israel, became a lawyer, was a prosecutor for in the Adolf Eichmann war crimes trial in Israel in the 60s, and later on he went on afterwards to become a justice in the Israeli Supreme Court. Let's hear what he has to say.
When I left Germany, when I was literally kicked out of Germany, what happened was that we were stopped at the border. SS men took us out, opened our luggage, threw all our things around. There was some argument with Berlin whether we could leave or not. And then finally, when the train already wanted to leave, they said, "Mach, dass herauskommt, get out, scram." So then I was 11 years old. I tried to get my luggage together, and I ran towards the train that wanted to start moving. And an SS man came running after me and kicked me in my behind, which in a way helped me because I flew up into the train. And but this idea of being literally kicked out of Germany, that really only later, in retrospect, became even more significant. But that was the last moment of my memory of Germany.
So let's think about, what does loss of citizenship mean? What did it actually mean? Citizens are entitled to protection. Non-citizens are not. Protection is one of the fundamental purposes of the law, and lack of entitlement to protection applies to property, looting, the body, beatings, and imprisonment, and ultimately human life, murder. So while the ultimate expression of this failure to protect is represented by Auschwitz and other concentration camps, the legal exclusion of the Jews, which began very slowly in 1933, systematically weakened and destroyed a strong community and made them really incapable of defending themselves within the system. The loss of citizenship was essential in the overall goal of completely annihilating the Jews. And because members of the legal community in Germany failed to stand up to the assault on their legal system, lawyers today would be wise to learn from those mistakes by reflecting on the lawyer's role in maintaining an open society based on the rule of law. But the first victims of systematic murder were the physically and mentally disabled Germans, Aryans. Look at the date of this legislation, July 14, 1933, shortly after Hitler assumed absolute power. Nazi ideology held that the Aryans were the master race. Well, there can't be defects in the master race. They must be eliminated. We're going to hear again from Lorenz Zeitner, and this time you'll be able to see him. This is a clip from the USC Shoah Foundation archives, and Mr. Zeitner is going to describe these laws and how they affected him specifically.
On my own side, in my own family, I have two elderly, there were two elderly great aunts who were killed, not for, nothing racial about that, they were devout Catholics, but they were old, and they had a house. And the town, Klagenfurt, in which they lived, was bombed. And in this bombardment, the house of one of the party bigwigs was destroyed, and he needed a house. So what he did was to have these two elderly ladies, ailing elderly ladies, committed to a hospital where they died within a day of each other, almost immediately. And what was being done was to eliminate what heartlessly was called unproductive eaters.
Unproductive eaters who had a house. So what was going on here was there was the program was called the T4 Nazi Euthanasia Program. And the purpose of that was to eliminate unproductive eaters. And a lot of times the gas chambers were, through trial and error, perfected in this program. Now, I want to be very clear. The word euthanasia, the way we use the word, is as a mercy killing. This was by no means a mercy killing. This was just out and out murder, but it was part of the way the Nazis used bureaucratic language to make horrible deeds appear benign. Now we're going to watch a scene from the motion picture Judgment at Nuremberg, which if you've never seen, I highly recommend it. It's must be the only Hollywood motion picture made specifically about the justice case. And in this scene, we're going to watch the actor Maximilian Schell, who we see here, who portrays a German defense attorney. And we're going to hear more about this subject that we're working on, the treatment of the mentally and physically disabled.
Dr. Wick, you referred to novel National Socialist measures introduced, among them sexual sterilization. Are you aware that sexual sterilization was not invented by National Socialism, but had been advanced for years before as a weapon in dealing with the mentally incompetent and the criminal?
Yes, I am aware of that.
Are you aware that it has advocates among leading citizens in many other countries?
I am not an expert on such laws.
Permit me to read one to you. This is a High Court opinion upholding such laws in existence in another country. And I quote, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange, indeed, if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices in order to prevent our being swamped by incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offsprings for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent their propagation by medical means in the first place. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." You recognize it now, Dr. Wick?
No, sir, I don't.
Actually, there is no particular reason you should, since the opinion upholds the sterilization law in the state of Virginia of the United States and was written and delivered by that great American jurist, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes.
There are times in our own history that we'd like to forget, but we do so at our peril. This is the citation to that case. It's very short, only 5 pages. I read it the other day. And the words that this defense attorney just read are taken directly from the opinion. And I guess the point I'm trying to make with this section is it's easy to view the Germans, all Germans of this period, as pure evil. And if we view all Germans under the Nazis as pure evil and so far beyond the norms of morality as moral monsters, then it's easy for us to ignore the possibility that under the right circumstances, any society can be taken over by fanatical ideas. But if we understand that ordinary people are capable of perpetrating horrible deeds and crimes, then we can be aware of changes in our society before chaos erupts. And I mentioned before, but I'll mention again, you know, if we can take the Hitler period, the Nazi period, and divide it in two. So we have from 1933 to 1939, very slow motion legalizing of discrimination. 1939 through 1945, World War II, immediate imposition of these laws that had been developed onto the occupied territories. In my opinion, the only time to affect change is right in the beginning, right at the moment when ideas begin to crystallize into discriminatory laws. That's when people can stand up. Because when the tanks are in the street, it's too late. We're going to watch a scene now from the motion picture The Reader. This is I'll just set the stage. This is a German courtroom in the 60s in West Germany. This is a German judge, and he is questioning a woman on trial for being a concentration camp guard during the war. And the actress that portrays this concentration camp guard is Kate Winslet. And we're dealing with the issue of, you know, what happened to the majority of Germans? What happened to them? The ones who didn't vote for Hitler, the majority. Let's watch.
Did you not realize that you were sending these women to their death?
Yes, but there were new arrivals. New women were arriving all the time, so the old ones had to make room for the new ones.
I'm not sure you understand.
We couldn't keep everyone. There wasn't room.
But what I'm saying, let me rephrase. To make room, you were picking women out and saying, you and you and you have to be sent back to be killed.
Well, what would you have done? Should I never have signed up at Siemens?
The reference to Siemens is a reference to the fact that major German conglomerates who were involved in chemical manufacturing, rubber, autos, military equipment, oftentimes set up factories, warehouses, operations facilities at concentration camps or next to ghettos. And they would use the slave labor from the concentration camps as their workforce. And they'd have a monetary arrangement with the SS where they'd pay, you know, the equivalent of pennies on the dollar for the labor. IG Farben, for example, was a major German conglomerate that had its facility at Auschwitz. So perhaps this guard, portrayed by the actress Kate Winslet, applied for a job in security at a German factory. So I read a book, Defying Hitler. It's a memoir by Sebastian Haffner. That's a pseudonym. It's not a history book. It tells the story of a young German attorney who was going through law school before Hitler came to power. He was going through all of his qualification, residencies, and exams during the elections when Hitler was gaining power and the takeover. But ultimately, he left Germany because he could not be part of that system. And he put himself in exile, self-imposed exile in England. He was there until '59, and he wrote a book, which he never published. He came back to Germany, was a journalist, was a law professor. After he died, his son found the memoir, translated it, and it was published in English in the year 2002. And it's interesting, the New York Times book review talks about it as astonishing, vividly conveys the texture of life under an emerging totalitarian regime. Texture of life, I like that. It's like very sort of the feeling that one has while going through life. Lorenz Zeitner, in the first clip, which you couldn't see, said it was sort of a change of climate where ideas which were unthinkable became thinkable, and then they became fact. Because history, when we just look, oftentimes when we look at history, it's black and white. It's hindsight with 20/20 vision. But going through reality every day is murky. It's chaotic. And so it's a good book to read if you want to get the feeling of what was happening at that period, during that period. And I'll just give one quote from Sebastian Haffner. There's an unsolved riddle in the history of the creation of the Third Reich. I think it's much more interesting than the question of who set fire to the Reichstag, the German parliament. It's the question, what became of the Germans? Even on March 5th, 1933, a majority of them voted against Hitler. What happened to that majority? Did they die? Did they disappear from the face of the earth? Did they become Nazis at that late stage? How is it possible that there was not the slightest visible reaction from them? And that's the question that I'm asking in this class. And so that is a discussion, we were talking about what became of ordinary Germans, and now what became of the judiciary. And just point of clarification, there are some lawyers on here, but there are many non-lawyers. Just the judiciary is the collective grouping of judges, prosecutors, lawyers, law professors, law students, that whole group of people who make up the legal system. The German judiciary prior to the Nazis was widely respected and independent. And while the Nazis certainly brought in Nazi judges, ideologues who would oversee courts or oversee prosecutors' offices, by and large, the same judiciary before the takeover, before the Nazi takeover, existed and continued on through the Nazi period and even after World War II. We're going to see another scene from the motion picture Judgment at Nuremberg. And in this scene, the actor Richard Widmark, who portrays the American prosecutor at this Nuremberg trial, the justice case, he's giving the opening statement at the trial. And I went back and I looked at the trial documents, and this is the nearly verbatim taken out of the opening statement from the justice case. Let's watch.
These men, together with their deceased or fugitive colleagues, are the embodiment of what passed for justice during the Third Reich. The defendants served as judges during the period of the Third Reich. Therefore, you, Your Honors, as judges on the bench, will be sitting in judgment of judges in the dock. And this is as it should be. For only a judge knows how much more a court is than a courtroom. It is a process and a spirit. It is the house of law. The defendants knew this too. They knew courtrooms well. They sat in their black robes and they distorted, they perverted, they destroyed justice and law in Germany.
The prosecution, please watch the light. The interpreter cannot follow you.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. They distorted, they perverted, they destroyed justice and law in Germany. Now, this in itself is undoubtedly a great crime. But the prosecution is not calling the defendants to account for violating constitutional guarantees or withholding due process of law. The prosecution is calling them to account for murder, brutalities, torture, atrocities. They share with all the leaders of the Third Reich responsibility for the most malignant, the most calculated, the most devastating crimes in the history of all mankind. And they are perhaps more guilty than some of the others. For they had attained maturity long before Hitler's rise to power. Their minds weren't warped at an early age by Nazi teachings. They embrace the ideologies of the Third Reich as educated adults, when they, most of all, should have valued justice.
What would have happened if a judge didn't go along, or a group of judges, or 30% of the judges and prosecutors and lawyers? What if they just didn't follow these new laws? And what if they recognized that they weren't grounded in the normal legal process and the judiciary had given up its independence? We actually know the answer, because a law professor and a former official of the Justice Department of Bremen, Germany, Ingo Müller, wrote a book, Hitler's Justice, The Courts of the Third Reich. And what he did was he went through all of the documented cases published during the Third Reich, during the Nazi era. And the Nazis were not embarrassed about what they were doing. They documented everything. And so there was a lot of material. And he went through every single case he could get his hands on, and every administrative decision and references to decisions. And in his entire search, he found one judge who went against the Nazis in the course of his duties. And this judge is Lothar Kriesig. Now, who is Lothar Kriesig? He was a judge at the Court of Guardianship in the town of Brandenburg. And in his capacity as a judge of this court, he was the guardian of a number of German mentally and physically disabled patients at a number of hospitals in his area. And when he heard that wards of his state, over which he was the guardian, had been removed to the T4 program, the Nazi euthanasia program, and murdered, he immediately sprung into action. He issued injunctions against the hospital. He filed criminal charges against the head of the program, a high-ranking Nazi official, Philip Bohler. He was called down to the Ministry of Justice and spoke to the Minister of Justice, gave him a solid dressing down. That's the equivalent of our Attorney General. And he was ordered to rescind his orders, withdraw the charges, and he refused. And the Minister of Justice said, well, what do you mean? Hitler has absolute power. He's the source of all law. And therefore, any order that he issues is law. The judge would have nothing of it, resigned in protest. Criminal charges were filed, investigations opened. Ultimately, he was permitted to retire with full pension. And look, in the year 1942, right in the middle of the war. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that if just none of this would ever have happened if all the judges and lawyers and prosecutors had simply just not gone along. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, in the one single case that we have, there were minimal consequences. So then we need to ask ourselves, well, what would have happened if people were more aware, if they had maintained control of the legal system? And as I said, we could ask about other professions as well, right? The education system, the medical system. I mean, were all German judges and lawyers evil? Or were they passive? Or did they just want to preserve their jobs, like Kate Winslet from the scene of the motion picture The Reader that we watched earlier? Now we're going back to the motion picture Judgment at Nuremberg. We're going to hear the German defense attorney cross-examining this witness who you've seen before. This is Dr. Wick. Dr. Wick is a witness for the American prosecution. He's a former German judge, law professor, theorist, who at a certain point said, I can't go along with this, and left the judiciary. Let's watch.
Do you consider yourself free of responsibility?
Yes, I do.
Dr. Wieck, did you ever swear to the civil servant loyalty oath of 1934?
Your Honor, I object. The witness doesn't have to answer that question. He's not on trial.
All Germany is on trial, Your Honor. This tribunal placed it on trial when it placed Ausyanning on trial. If responsibility is to be found, the widest latitude is to be permitted.
Objection overruled.
Did you ever swear to the civil servant loyalty oath of 1934?
Everyone did.
We are not interested in what everyone did. We are interested in what you did. Would you read the oath from the Reichslaw Gazette, March 1933?
I swear that I shall be obedient to the leader of the German Reichen people, Adolf Hitler, that I shall be loyal to him, that I will observe the laws, and that I will conscientiously fulfill my duties, so help me God.
Everyone swore to it. It was mandatory.
Yes. But you are such a perceptive man, Dr. Wieck. You could see what was coming. You could see that National Socialism was leading Germany to disaster. It was clear to anyone who had eyes and ears. Didn't you realize what it would have meant if you, and men like you, would have refused to swear to the oath? It would have meant that Hitler could never have come to absolute power.
What would have happened if more people didn't go along? This is the last slide. There's a lot going on here, so let me set the stage. We're going to hear an audio from a lecture that I attended at the Allowed series of the Los Angeles Central Library. The speaker is Father Patrick Dubois. He's a French Catholic priest. He has a very thick French accent, so just go with it, pay attention as much as you can. And in recent years, Father Dubois has uncovered many mass burial sites of Jews who were shot into open pits, which they were often forced to dig themselves. Now, Father Dubois goes into these villages in the former Soviet Union, conducts interviews with eyewitnesses who were present when the Nazis murdered their Jewish neighbors. And the audio begins with a question by a Holocaust survivor, Jean Greenstein of Los Angeles, who grew up in this area in Eastern Europe. Jean passed away several years ago. Simultaneously, we're going to watch a slideshow of photographs known as the Auschwitz Album. These are photographs taken by the SS of the arrival at Auschwitz of a transport of Hungarian Jews, trainloads of Hungarian Jews. And we're going to see the whole process where they're removed from the train, separated from their belongings, separated into men and women. They pass through a selection by German doctors who choose a small percentage for slave labor, and the rest are sent towards the gas chambers. The album was found after Auschwitz was liberated by a Holocaust survivor, one of the inmates of the camp, after the guards left, after the Russian soldiers who had liberated the camp left. And she discovered, shockingly, that she was in the photos. It was of her transport, of her family, of her village, of her close neighbors and relatives, most of whom had been murdered by that point. And if you look closely, you'll be able to spot her. Her name is Lily Jacobs. Let's watch and listen.
Just hang on one second, just get the microphone to you. There you go.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question. You know, I was born in Eastern Czechoslovakia, and Aktion Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppen, were trained in my hometown, and most of them were volunteers or Austrians. And the question is, you know, some of these people I went to school with, and they really weren't anti-Semitic when I met them. How on earth would people be able to train just to murder people one bullet at a time? Is there any explanation to that?
I have no explanation. That's a real deep question. We don't understand because nobody understands. Nobody understands. I will give you the case of the village of Lubavitch. The Nazi, there were a few Russian male who were in the village because most of them were in army, of course, and a few of them refused to go to army, so they were hidden in the village, not to be mobilized by a Red Army. When the Germans arrived, they opened a desk immediately and saw that these people could unregister and become policemen in one day. 1 month after, these 20 policemen killed 500 Jews in the village who were their neighbors. We have no answer. We have no answer because these people, some were Nazi, some were not, some were trained, some were not trained. It seems when you give the ability to somebody to kill people without any punishment in the law, you can get it relatively easily. Yeah, I know. And sometimes they were not trained. But it means that the humanity is very fragile. I think you must understand it was an order to kill, but it's also an authorization to kill. It was legal. When it's legal to kill, imagine in Los Angeles, we say that for 15 days, it's legal to kill, I don't know, the Chinese and or any population. In this case, I would let the city because I wouldn't know if I will be a victim or a killer.
Over here, front row, and then...
I will give you an example because it was not always big killers like that. We got the example of a grandmother, an Ukrainian grandmother, Greco-Catholic. Her daughter married a Jew. She was against this wedding. Where it begins, the Jew goes to army and they have 6 little children. The mother goes to the market, the grandmother brings the 6 little children to the Gestapo to make them shot, and they have been shot. And she went back, it was legal. So she died in her bed 10 years after. It was legal, you must understand it was legal. So anybody could do it, for any private reason. So any small problem could change in a crime. So imagine in your life today, with who you have problem. And imagine suddenly tomorrow it's legal to kill them. So you don't sleep the night, say perhaps I could. And it's like that it happened. It's like that it happened. It was legal. It was legal. So people told me we killed the neighbor because we wanted the house. They had a beautiful house, so they killed them. As like that.
This gentleman.
They legalized the crime. They legalized the crime. The gypsy is the same. Huh? Anybody could kill gypsy. Anybody could kill disabled people. There are free category that could be killed by anybody. So there were the professional killers from behind that group, the non-professional killers from local police, and after anybody.
They legalized the crime. I'll close by quoting from the book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, written by Professor Timothy Snyder from Yale University, who's a history professor at Yale, who's written extensively about totalitarianism, dictatorships, Nazism. And he says, defend institutions. It is institutions that help us to preserve decency. They need our help as well. Do not speak of our institutions unless you make them yours by acting on their behalf. Institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution, a court that you care about, a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, so much for this presentation. It's been so educational, I think, both for lawyers and non-lawyers, and also quite chilling in a number of ways. We have some time for audience questions, and some people have already submitted questions. If you haven't, but you would like to, please type your question in the Q&A box, And I will start with this. A number of questions are essentially the "could this happen here" question. You showed a film clip that quoted the US Supreme Court opinion upholding forced sterilization of those deemed undesirable. Now it's been almost 100 years since that happened in the United States, or since that opinion, but could the erosion of rights that you described that happened in Germany in the 1930s happen in the United States? And if not, what is it that prevents that from happening?
That's a big question. I don't, that I think all of us, I wish we were all in a room and we could have that conversation about could that happen. At that time of the decision, there were approximately 30 states that had legalized forced sterilization. And we have strong institutions, but I do think it's incumbent upon each of us to, as Professor Snyder says, defend the institutions. As opposed to institutions defending us, we need to defend them and support them in an ongoing way. Didn't Benjamin Franklin say, you know, you have a republic if you can keep it? It's hard work to be an informed citizen, but that's our work. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, I mean, it's not really an answerable question, but definitely something that your presentation makes us all think about. Another question. It sounds like this is an audience question. It sounds like some of the early laws were adopted locally. Is that so? And did the national government direct localities to take certain action? Or did they act independently?
It was a hodgepodge. I mean, the Nazi system was complete control from the center, but it permitted local laws to rise up, and that's why there were so many. But each locality was able to take upon itself, like, okay, this is going on here, we don't like it, let's pass this law. But everything was sort of coming from the top. It was directed from the top.
Someone asked about the concept of giving the Volk, the people, as a German nation, a set of rights that overrode the rights of minorities. Can you discuss that?
I think that's really exactly what happened. I mean, everything was racialized. So the Jews were targeted as a race. I mean, there had been anti-Semitism in German society for centuries. Jews had lived in Germany since the year 1000, right? So it wasn't as if Hitler created anti-Semitism and it had never been there. But Hitler racialized it. It became racial. And then there was this idea of purity of the German people, the Aryan, the Volk. And with the, you know, that's why you had to get rid of the disabled Aryans. You had to get rid of the Jews. You had to get rid of the Gypsies or Roma. And then there were other groups as well, the LGBT community, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, Slavs. And it really was, it elevated the Aryans above everyone else legally as well as in every other way.
You showed clips from films depicting the Nuremberg justice trial, I believe. Can you explain, just give an overview of the Nuremberg trials and explain how the justice trial fit into that overall framework? And specifically, someone is asking how many Nazi war criminals were convicted of war crimes.
Good question. So the framework of Nuremberg was, there was the initial trial, the International Military Tribunal, the IMT, conducted by the four allies who defeated the Germans, the US, the USSR, the British, and the French, prosecuting the top Nazi war criminals. But there were only 20, maybe 21, who were prosecuted. Then in the American zone, right? Because Germany was divided into zones, the British zone, the French zone, the American zone, the Russian zone. And so the Americans conducted an additional 12 trials. One of them was the justice trial that we talked about. The British had trials, the French had trials, the Soviets had trials. Then afterwards, there were trials conducted by West Germany. You know, Germany was divided into two, with East Germany being under the Soviet control, essentially, and West Germany being allied with the West. And there were war crimes trials in Germany. There was the Adolf Eichmann trial, which I mentioned. The prosecutor, we saw a clip from him, Gabriel Bach, was a member of that. So there were many trials, and in fact, they just continued to have trials until very recently. So I cannot give you an answer of how many were convicted, but I can tell you it was not a lot.
Did any of the Nazi period judges remain on the bench after the end of the war?
Yes. The book, Ingo Müller, Hitler's Justice, The Courts of the Third Reich. It's not that long. If you're interested in this subject, it's the exhaustive search that German law professor conducted, in the late 80s and 90s.
Thank you. Were there any other books that you mentioned? Someone was asking for you to repeat the names of the books.
Sure. So Hitler's Justice by Ingo Müller, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. Defying Hitler, a Memoir by Sebastian Haffner, Haffner. And then Saul Friedlander, Nazi Germany and the Jews. It's actually 2 volumes, but it spans the, one is called the Years of Persecution, and then the second is called The Years of Extermination. And our book, this class essentially is dealt with in the years of persecution, because I'm trying to isolate that period of time when it was legal, it was the legalization of this discrimination, as opposed to the war years, which were, under cover of war, horrible, horrible things happen.
There's a good question. It's a little bit beyond the scope of your presentation, and we're short on time, but if the question is about opposition to the imposition of the laws of the Third Reich, and of course there was resistance in different forms among different groups. This question is specifically, was there any overt religious opposition to the Third Reich's laws? But if you want to just generally give a little talk about resistance in Germany.
Yes, there was, so one of the, Lothar Kriesig, the judge of the Court of Guardianship who resigned with full pension, he was also a member of a church, and he resisted. He had a history of resisting the Nazis. When Jewish judges and lawyers were prohibited from working in the courts, like in 1933 and 34, he protested. When a fellow high-ranking member of his church was arrested, he protested. There were churches who resisted. There were churches who went along. It's a mixed bag. I would say in balance, not enough people resisted. But there were instances when people did resist that it proved effective. And the earlier the resistance, the more effective it was.
Okay, we're going to have to stop at that. We're about out of time. I want to thank you so much, Jeff, for your presentation and for everything you do for the museum. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us again for another program. I'll give you just a brief overview of what's coming up. This Thursday, August 20th at 11 a.m., we will host a talk by Auschwitz survivor Edith Franke. And later that day, Thursday at 5 p.m., join us for a discussion of the film Life is Beautiful. It's the last in our summer film series. Next week, we have a number of programs, including Holocaust survivor talks and virtual tours of our museum galleries. And those are being offered next week in English and in Spanish. You can find more information about all of our virtual events on our website, which is lamoth.org. The museum provides these online programs at no charge. If you've made a donation, thank you. If you haven't and you're enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by going to our website and making a donation. I want to thank you again, Jeff, so much, and to everyone for joining us today. Take care, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.